Just a few words of background on why we have this track. So a group of us as members of the African Digital Rights Network have been doing some research over the last year or so on closings and openings of civic space. And we did a series of country reports in 10 African countries, looking at how, in a broader context worldwide of closing civic space, there were many interesting and positive examples of citizens making creative use of digital tools to open online civic space. And our research originally imagined that we would, our main job would be documenting those openings of online civic space. In fact, as that research has progressed, we found that at least as important was the growing pushback against that, both from government and non-state actors, to close down online civic space. So that was the broad canvas, the background, closing of offline civic space and opening of online civic space, and now a whole series of measures that are being taken to push back and close down online civic space. And so we put together this track and asked for papers to speak into that space. And I'm glad that we've had very creative framings of that from different perspectives. We've got another session tomorrow with 3 more papers, and we've got papers from India, from Mexico, as well as papers that are non-country specific. Today we were supposed to have 4 papers, but as I mentioned earlier, 2 of the papers had to withdraw because of COVID-related issues. So we're actually going to have 2 sessions. George is going to kick us off in a second, and then Becky will present after that. We'll take questions immediately after George's presentation before moving on to Becky's. And because we have less papers, we'll have more time for questions and we'll be able to finish early. Okay, George, please begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Tony. I'll set up my slides now. I'm sure everyone can see the slides. Okay, so my presentation today is in a sense, it's looking at a moment where those 2 kind of factors, the opening and closure, come together in one particular moment. And the moment I'm looking at is that Zimbabwean Lives Matter, hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter protest, online protest campaign that happened, basically around August 2020. So that was in the heart of in the very depths of the lockdown last year. And that, as the argument I'm trying to make is that was a moment where you had these 2 forces, people who wanted to open up space, civic space, and people who wanted to close up civic space actually contending in that particular period. And so it becomes quite a useful, point or a useful moment in time to actually start to examine these events as they happen together. So my presentation is really going to be trying to sketch out some of my observations, focusing in particular, I'll be focusing a lot on the disinformation network that I began to see emerging during this period. So what were the people who were trying to close up civic space doing? So that's what I'll pay quite a bit more attention to during this presentation. Okay. So the immediate political context to the Zimbabwean Lives Matter online protest was the failure of a 31st July protests. There was supposed to be a protest on, that was supposed to happen on 31st of July, but what happened was that on this particular day, the government actually, they stationed soldiers all over the country in the main cities, and this protest never happened, despite the fact that they had been drumming up this protest for weeks. And the key organizers of that protest were arrested, and they were detained without trial for several weeks. And we also saw the families of some of the people that the government wanted to arrest. The families were basically held hostage. They were detained, and the idea was to force the persons of interest to present themselves to the police. And what you also had happening during this period was that the government was taking advantage of the COVID-19 lockdown regulations in order to stop people from protesting. So there were a number of people who were arrested, when they protested against certain, government policies, and the arrest was based on COVID-19 regulations. And this is something we saw in a number of other African countries as well, the ones that are led by authoritarian leaders. So you had this kind of pressure cooker situation whereby people weren't able to protest on the ground for a number of reasons, heavy-handed government response, COVID-19 regulations. So what we then had happening was the channeling of protest onto online platforms. And this is that outrage that was boiling over is what then finds expression through the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter. And this hashtag then goes viral around the world. People in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in London, and in the US are picking up this hashtag. On some days, you find that there are maybe around 711,000 tweets that are, that have that hashtag, and even more on other days. So this is picked up in quite a number of places around the world. And this is an example of how they went about trying to promote the hashtag. So you'd have prominent people. So it was not just Zimbabwean. So you have, for example, this tweet by a prominent South African politician, and he's mentioning Lupita Nyong'o, a famous Kenyan actor, and he makes the point: can you help us bring global attention to the human rights abuses in Africa, the attack on Black lives, which need urgent global solidarity. A burning topic right now is the arrest of journalists and other activists in Zimbabwe. And this was a way of hailing a number of, prominent people around the world into the conversation. And by doing this, the hashtag really gained ground. And if you can see the bottom left corner, the bottom right corner, you can see where it says politics trending, and it, the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter is trending, and you can see that there are 711,000 tweets on this particular topic. And this is how they managed to continue to build this protest and gain a lot of momentum through using these kinds of strategies. What was interesting also is that they set up a number of fake accounts. So one of the fake accounts that I started tracking initially was a fake account of the Malawian president, Lazarus Chakwera. And in the early days, it was actually one of the most influential nodes in pushing this hashtag. But after a while, it became clear that this wasn't actually the Malawian president. He had just been elected, and he was, the kind of early statements he was making, he sounded like a progressive African leader who was against corruption and everything. So he was chosen by whoever it is who created that fake account to be the face of a kind of prominent person who will be pushing this message. Obviously, it wouldn't have made sense if they used a kind of Museveni fake account to push this kind of message. So they wanted someone who would be somewhat credible. So they were also using I think there was a fake account of Ellen Sirleaf Johnson as well, and a number of fake accounts for of celebrities as well. So they were also using these kind of underhanded methods of trying. And when people saw that, oh, Lazarus Chakwera has actually joined this, and you had people joining the movement as well, joining the protests. So these were quite effective methods in the early days. And then after a while, you find that this online protest gains its own momentum, and it no longer needs those fake accounts to continue. So even when the fake accounts are revealed to have actually been fake, it still continues moving. You still have a lot of momentum behind the online protest. So I was tracking this hashtag, for all of August 2020, and it after a couple of weeks, it kind of dies down. A lot of the head of steam kind of dissipates by the end of August. But as I was doing this, I then became interested in the response that the government had to this online protest campaign, and obviously these moments of online protests are fascinating, because you then want to see, okay, so how does the government organize its own machinery, and how does it try to respond? So one of the things I was curious to see, after all this news about, Russian bots and all this kind of thing, I was trying to see, can I find evidence of, inauthentic, coordinated behavior, and will I find bots? So I started looking for these kind of things, and I did indeed find coordinated activity. And just a note on the methods that I use, I used Node Excel. I used digital ethnography. I used NVivo and a Twitter analytics service called Twitonomy. I also used Botometer and Hoaxy as part of my research. So I'll use the rest of the presentation just to discuss what I found in terms of the disinformation networks that began to emerge. So as soon as I started looking at what was going on Twitter, I started to find evidence of the coordinated activity. And what I did, I identified about 71 pro-government accounts that were actively tweeting in support of the government. And these were folks that continued to emerge or were being mentioned by other accounts. But what I then decided to do is to focus on some of the more active Twitter accounts. And then, so I decided to focus on 32 specific accounts that tweeted more than 30 times a day. And I have there a kind of list of, so you had, in terms of, there were 13 of those accounts that tweeted between 30 and 50 tweets a day on average. Obviously, on some days they would go very high, and on some days there would be limited activity, but on average. And then there were 7 accounts that tweeted between 50 and 70 tweets a day, and 6 accounts that tweeted between 70 and 100 tweets. And then there were 6 accounts that tweeted over 100 tweets a day. And on average, the most that I found, or the most, was 168 tweets a day in that particular account. So that was a human being. These weren't bots. These were real human beings that were, actively sparring with different people on Twitter, and signal boosting, tweets from prominent government people. So these were human beings. They could be sock puppets. In some cases, they were actually genuine people using their own accounts. So how were they going about this? They monitored their accounts of specific categories of people. So opposition politicians, journalists, civil society activists, and Western embassies, and even government officials in Western governments. So one of the funny things I saw was that these guys, so they were actually quite agile, and they were on the ball. I remember seeing a number of them responding to a tweet by Dominic Raab. So I follow Zimbabwean politics quite a bit, but I'm not actually every day searching for the one tweet that Dominic Raab tweets on Zimbabwe, but these guys found it. It's even things like, in the US, the undersecretary who's in charge of Africa, when that person tweets on Zimbabwe, these guys were finding these things, and then they would use those as a sort of basis to then launch their counterattacks on the US, and use that as a basis for their propaganda. So as soon as that person or organization tweeted, they would respond, aggressively, with derision. And what they would do, the important thing is that they would then mention other members of their network. They would mention maybe 5 or 6 other accounts. And that was the signal to hail their colleagues into that conversation. And then they would swarm like bees. That's when they would then descend on this, tweet or that account, and then they'll start raising a ruckus, whether it's insulting whoever the person is. So for example, let's say it's the UK embassy that tweets and expresses concern about the arrest of journalists. Someone would pick up on that tweet very soon. So one of the first responses would be these guys. So within the top 5, the first 5 responses was usually these accounts, and basically they would then say, look, you colonists, Zimbabwe will never be a colony again, on all these kind of things, or they would mention the slave trade and that kind of thing. and what they basically did is they then hijacked this conversation that was supposed to be maybe about freedom of press and, you know, the abuse of the legal system. And it, you know, they started making it about the slave trade and the UK's role in that, or colonialism and the UK's role in that. And what they managed to do was to really effectively drown out any other conversations that were that were budding or building up on social media around, you know, important democratic principles like freedom of the press and that kind of thing. And so if you think about the kind of strategies they used, there was counter messaging. For example, if one hashtag emerged by, you know, opposition or sort of pro-democracy figures, they would push a different message. Or, for example, character assassination, just trying to destroy someone's credibility. They do that quite a bit. Or trolling their adversaries. They're just, some of them use very coarse language. So they just come in and just start hammering folks, you know, insulting them in vulgar language and that kind of thing. So this was quite common, or disrupting debates. They'll just get in there and disrupt any debate that starts to happen. So they didn't really like this idea of rational disputation on Twitter or online, basically. And there was a lot of gaslighting that was happening. Some of it was actually quite concerning, because it was reminiscent of the situation with the white helmets and the Russian trolls, you know, in Syria, whereby someone then committed suicide. And we had a case like that, where it started to affect the mental health of one of the youngest female MPs in Zimbabwe, where you could see that the sustained effort and the attacks on her, you could actually see it was starting to get really worrying, where you're like, what are we witnessing in real life? When you're witnessing it in real life, it's quite distressing, actually. And they'd obviously also try and distract, you know, attention, the kind of classic whataboutism, where someone raises this and they, what about that? And try and, you know, distract from the conversation in that way. And like I said earlier, I found no bots. There were human beings behind them. Some of the accounts were you know, sock puppet accounts, but there were real human beings behind them. There was no kind of, you know, automated system of tweeting. And I think this is what, and I'll refer to this towards the end, this is because I think what I was witnessing in the Zimbabwean case was disinformation on a shoestring budget, and that's why you didn't really have very sophisticated kind of technical things happening in that respect. So when I looking at the network, I started identifying a couple of, you know, levels within this hierarchy, or this kind of machinery. And the first were the agenda setters. And these were senior government officials who set the tone of the debate. They were the ones pushing out the key pro-establishment ideas. And one of the key strategies they used was to do Twitter threads. So these were the kind of people who would pose as these kind of intellectuals, and they'd say, you know, here, I'm doing a thread on this idea about, you know, such and such. And then, you know, everyone else would start to signal boost that thread, or they'd pick up different ideas from that. So they were the agenda setters who are at the sort of almost at the apex of this system. And you could see some of them would, you know, there's quite a few who use, you know, fake names in their accounts, but we came to realize that, you know, it was revealed that, for example, one is the presidential spokesperson who uses a kind of pseudonym on his for his Twitter account. The next level were the amplifiers, and those are a lot of those 32 accounts I was referring to, and they did a lot of retweeting and a lot of trolling as well. And these could be either sock puppet accounts, or they could be real people. And when you look at the analytics for their accounts, you'd see that a lot of what they're doing is either retweeting or responding. They don't seem to have, you know, original ideas to put out there, original tweets, or they don't even have threads of their own. What they're doing is they're either replying or they're retweeting. Then you also had the pseudo news organizations, and you had quite a lot. There was, you know, Zoom Bulawayo, Zoom Harare, and all these kind of things. And their idea was to push out positive news stories on the government. You had one account that focused on financial news that tried to present this idea that the government's budget is under control, that the government is meeting its targets in terms of inflation or in terms of development projects. And these were then picked up by the amplifiers, and then they would push all these ideas. So they gave them, in a sense, positive news to push out. And then you had the AstroTurf accounts. These were a kind of mass of accounts and they had formulaic, alphanumeric names. And a lot of them, you'd find that they would tweet infrequently. So for example, one of these accounts would follow me. And before I decide whether to follow back or not or block, I check and see that this person hasn't really tweeted. And they had one of those kind of names that were just kind of BCD 1953, that kind of thing. And I guess I'd have to look a bit more closely to see what function that these accounts serve, but they seem to follow people of interest. So you'd get people like this following you or following other people, and they seem to be waiting in the wings for something or other. But I need to look more closely into that. You also had these invisible techies. There was a lot of invisible work that was being done to produce the graphics, the memes, to edit the photos and the videos. For example, because I had followed a lot of these people, my Twitter feed became somewhat unrepresentative of a normal feed, because Twitter being what it is, the algorithm then, if they realize that you seem to like pro-government trolls, they then sort of bring more and more of those folks onto your feed. So there was a time where I was really sort of inundated by these. But what you then got for that, and where it served my purposes, is that I then started to see the kind of common threads. So for example, one photo would be tweeted by 4 or 5 people. But what you then started to see is that these photos, someone is selecting these photos and is sort of telling people to push out these photos, and, or particular video that is supposed to have been edited that, assassinates some politician's character or something. There was someone behind the scenes who was doing this kind of, tech work and providing them with the material in order to be able to then attack or discredit or distract or gaslight. So there are the invisible techies that were out there. So those were some of the actors in the network. And I guess, my impression was that, so when you look at, for example, the work by Philip Howard, you see that there are a number of approaches that, governments could take. So you could either get a PR firm in the West that will give you a suite of services, and it could give you, like lobbying, it could give you image, control, and it could also give you social media campaign services, and they would have their own sort of set of accounts, and they'll set this up for you. Or you could have governments bootstrapping this on their own. And in the Zimbabwean situation, what we had was really disinformation on a shoestring budget. And you had an under-resourced government that was trying to run an under-resourced troll army. And when I say disinformation on a shoestring, I'm not using that derisively. I'm just, trying to characterize what I saw, because this does not mean that they were ineffective. They were actually quite effective in some respects. And when you look at the way they shut down important conversations, and they made the public sphere toxic and polarized, and made it people incapable of, having important debates and coming to certain, consensuses about, for example, the kind of democratic polity that people want. They basically poisoned the public sphere in some sectors of it, at least. And they hounded certain opposition figures, sometimes with those sort of heartbreaking results. The MP I was talking about, the member of parliament, she actually was, she failed to come to court. So the story is that they abducted 3 members of, the movement for democratic change, 3 women, and they abducted them and then they tortured them. And the reason was because they broke COVID-19 lockdown restrictions and, staged a protest related to service delivery. And so they were abducted, they were tortured, and then they were released, and they had to get treated in the hospital for quite a while. But the cases against them, there were cases brought against them for breaking COVID-19 rules. So they had to continuously come back to the magistrate's court for those cases to go. And what normally happens in Zimbabwe is that you're just put on remand and you're forced to come maybe to the court 3 times a week. And sometimes your case is just deferred to another day. And she couldn't come on one particular time because she was having mental health problems and she had to be treated. So she was in hospital. And because of that, in fact, the magistrate ordered that she be, of police go and actually take her out of hospital. So she went and she was picked out of the hospital and she came. And when she got to court, she then used, her defense was that she had mental health challenges and she was getting treatment. Now, the problem is that in Zimbabwe, the Public Health Act, the Mental Health Act, is quite broad, and it gives the government, powers that are quite broad. So once she made that statement, the magistrate then said, all right, in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to put you in a state mental institution where you're then going to be tested. So for 2 weeks, we're going to put you in a mental institution, and they're going to be testing that. Are you indeed suffering from anxiety and depression and those kind of things? So, the situation was actually made even worse. And so she had to go in for 2 weeks in a mental institution being, examined, and then when they then decide that okay, she does indeed have these problems, and then she's brought back to court, and then she was sent back to jail. So it was in and out of jail or mental institutions. So after that, that's something that would take its toll on anyone. So there are situations where you can see that they are really having an impact, and the important impact is not, so it's not just that it's impacting this one person, but it sends a message to anyone else who might want to raise their head above the parapet, that look, the way this person is being treated is what will happen to you. So in other cases, you'd have these trolls actually tweeting out photos of this person walking, in shops. For example, they created a collage of CCTV footage of this person going into a shop and into like an ordinary shop. So clearly they were surveilling her, and they would then go to shops and say, give us the video footage of this person at this particular time. And then they created, and so they were trying to prove that this person is not actually, suffering from any illness. And they were using that to attack her on Twitter. So it was actually quite distressing to witness this happen. So there's a sense that they are quite brutal and effective in those kind of exercises, and they have substantial reach in terms of the way that they're being able to plug themselves in a number of conversations, and I'll show that using some network graphs. But what you do see that what they lack, because this is disinformation on a shoestring, is that they lack the ability to act in a coordinated way. And and obviously, if this was being run by a PR firm, they would know how they would be sending out messages, and they would know how to do this. So sometimes you have quite discordant things happening. For example, earlier last year, when the decision was being made about whether to use the Chinese vaccine or not, in the beginning, the trolls were attacking the Chinese vaccine. And once the government said, look, we need to support the vaccine, they then moved and switched and started supporting it. So you get this kind of confusion within the ranks. And they're not as agile. So one of the things that was clear is that in August, they were caught flat-footed when the Zimbabwean Lives Matter hashtag took off. And till the end of August, they really struggled to respond, to create an effective response. The other thing that you see is that there are tensions within the structures. So you have, you have a lot of tensions, and I'll show a couple of tweets of those tensions that you see. So every now and then you get dissonance that emerges within the ranks. So these are just social media graphs of, this is the social network graph of the conversations that were happening around Zimbabwean Lives Matter. And, just a kind of graphic representation of the online crowd that was debating and engaging around this hashtag. And this is a hashtag, the kind of counter messaging hashtag that the government official wanted to put out. And as you can see, when you compare from an organic conversation around something that resonates versus something that is trying to be pushed out. And you can see there's that one node where all this is coming from, and it doesn't really gain that much traction. But when you look at, this is a social network site of a pro-government accounts network, and you can see that they are part of a number of networks, and they're involved and they're engaging within a number of conversations. So it's not as if they are in the kind of sort of dark corners of the internet. They are part of the conversation and part of the online discussion. So they're not to be dismissed. They're actually effective in those regards. And again, that's another graph of the pro-government account network, the people that they are reaching out to and the kinds of conversations that are happening around them. So they do have reach. And this is an example of the public spat. So Kudzai Mutesi is one of the people who had been coordinating the troll army. It's called Varakashi, and he was coordinating them. But every now and then, Kudzai feels that he wants to criticize the account there with the donkey whose face is the presidential spokesperson. And he finds that every now and then he wants to criticize the president's spokesperson for one thing or the other. And this was one instance. But what then happened was that it revealed the fact that, there was this troll army that was being paid. So for example, he says, so for example, in this tweet, he says, when you find yourself being cheered by the very constituency you were engaged to fight, ask yourself if you're still serving your purpose. So you have this opening up, sort of the curtains. We can see behind the curtain what is happening. And the other tweet where he says, and you're obliged even agreeing to be paid for us. There are two references where he talks about paying Kudzai Mutesi, and this is a presidential spokesperson. And obviously the retort by Kudzai Mutesi is, Mutesi might have done nothing, but you have done a lot in taking us back to the Stone Age. The president must replace you with someone with a better approach to issues, a presidential spokesperson who spends a month without holding a televised press conference. Come on, man. So it seems that there's also jockeying for position within the ranks. So it's partly dissonance and, different views about things, but also there seems to be competition for positions that's going on. But these public spats that happen within that kind of disinformation network help us to see behind the curtain. So that's part of the value of them, besides telling us that there is dissent. And when you think about the sock puppet accounts, so this is one of them. As you can see, there's this image that's being used by this person called Christine Letokuhle. But this image is an image that has been taken from a Kenyan site. And this is how they then form these sock puppet accounts. And obviously, once you see a flag and once you see a soldier there, as you can see, there's a Zimbabwean flag and a soldier there, you then see that almost screams troll army, in a sense. So it's pro-establishment troll army. But again, you get this case where they're stealing photographs from all over the internet. And this is another case where, this sock puppet account takes something from, they take a photo from a Kenyan account. So that's, so those are an example of the sock puppets. So I guess that's, I think I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Or any thoughts that people might have. Those are some of the things that I, in my early attempts to understand what is going on with these networks, those are the things that I've been finding. And obviously there's still lots more to discover, but so far, those are the kind of things I've been finding. And I'd be happy to have, questions or other conversations, yeah.
Okay, thank you, George. Yeah, so open it up for questions. Anybody? Questions or comments? Becky, and then Micah.
That was really fascinating, thank you. I've got a methodological question that it was obviously a lot of work, and I've been talking to Tony quite a lot about the kind of accessible ways to do social media analysis. and I'm just so impressed with the kind of the presentation of the data and all the work that got into it. Do you have any kind of key takeaways to help sort of support other people who want to do this kind of analysis? Because it's clearly like very time consuming and quite technical. Any kind of key tools that you thought worked really well, or anything in particular?
So I really liked, so it had to be a grab bag of tools. That's what I found. So there was no one specific tool that helped me to crack the code, as it were. But what I liked, especially when I was working on, because I was working on Twitter, was some of the Twitter analytics tools that are out there. So Twitonomy is really great, because with Twitonomy, it would, for example, if I saw an interesting account that I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here? With Twitonomy, I could then actually go into it and try and figure out, so what's really going on here? And I could then see that the tweets, they would break down the tweets and say, all right, this person, most of their tweets are actually retweets, and these are the number of responses. And that would really then help me to, and they would also list the people that they most engage with. Who do they most mention? Who do they most respond to? Who do they most retweet? And using that, that then helped me to start to pick out who are the folks that I need to actually start looking at again. So that's how I then started picking out a lot of these other networks where, so Twitonomy was a really good place for me to start as well. And yeah, because I think those Twitter analytics services are really useful. Yeah. So if there was one thing, I would say that was quite useful. Yeah.
George, I was interested on that kind of methodological issue. You know, when you start to see patterns and you know that there's some kind of inauthentic behavior going on, that's a very different thing than being able to show that it's inauthentic behavior. And you've gotten some success, and you use the profiles of Jamwanda and Kudzai as two elements in that lie machine. But I'm presuming, and this is my question, I'm presuming that the way you got to know that was qualitative rather than anything else. It was, but tell us, how did you work that out?
Yeah, so I guess it was qualitative. So, but once I knew the accounts that I would want to follow, I could then start to see what's going. So with Kudzai MTC, if you look back in the day, there was actually a time when he was actually trying to actively recruit people to the troll army. So you would actually put out a post, and I've got these posts where you would say, look, we're looking for people to join Marakashi. But obviously every now and then he wavers. A year later it said, I know nothing about this, and everything. So I guess if you're part of a lie machine, you find it easier to be switching whatever you say. But then you actually have him saying these kind of things. So because of that, I had those points where to look. And then once I had them, so that pro-government account network I was showing was actually the Jamwanda, that's George Charamba's account. So I then went in and I said, oh, look, if I search him, who does he engage with? What kind of reach does his ideas have? And then I started to see, so you have a qualitative insight, and then once you start to do some of the quantitative work, you start to see it confirmed. But what's interesting, so Jamwanda is at that very top agenda setter kind of level of the hierarchy. So that's where he is at. And so he does threads and that kind of thing. When you look at the number of tweets, he doesn't even register as much, as some of these guys like who are doing 168 tweets. He sometimes, a day he might just do, on average 7 or something like that. So he's quite low on that. But these are the, amplifiers. They're in there daily. And that's the funny thing, where you have the government spokesperson is less than 10 tweets a day, and this one random person from somewhere else is actually doing 168. And it's almost like, you're weeping or you're mourning more than the bereaved. And that's suspicious in itself. And you're like, so what's going on there? So it's those kind of things where you go from qualitative to quantitative, and you see, and going back and forth in that way. And then obviously testing to see, is this a bot? Or, is it not? So I do those kind of things.
Miko, did you still want to come in? You had your hand up.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks very much, George, for a very, very interesting discussion and also paper coming from a context where disinformation actually fuels political division in the current debate that we have here. Well, I'm based in the Philippines, so I'm very interested in your paper. The question that I would like to ask is, how do you actually, one of your major findings is that this is an under-resourced activity. I was just wondering, how do you came up with that kind of a conclusion? Was it coming from the data? Or was it coming from somewhere else? So I mean, I was just like, because that for me as a conclusion, I'm asking that because in the initial work that, for example, the likes of Jonathan Ong did in the Philippines, they were initially thinking that this was actually just some random thing or an under-resourced pattern of some sort. But then later on, they realized that this was actually something really, really big and actually overly funded, as a matter of fact. So I was wondering, where did you get that conclusion and how that you came about that finding? Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess part of looking at, so they established these kind of troll armies. So soon after the 2017 coup in Zimbabwe, the new government who rises on the back of the new president decides that, you know what, social media seems to be something important and we need to engage with the opposition on social media. And once he makes that decision, he then, they start forming this troll army. And what then happens is that this is in the run-up to the 2018 July elections, and there's quite a concerted effort to make sure that these folks are active. But over time, so you had this peak of activity, and so the kind of, from speaking to people, it seems that these people were provided with iPads and maybe $10 a week to do this activity. But over time, this then stopped. So in the run up to the elections, you had these young graduates, and I've spoken to people who were actually aware of the adverts, where people were being told, they're looking for people to employ. But then after, the kind of election season, passed, there was not much in the way of resources being put out. So you still had, for example, the intelligence, they've got a social media desk there, and they seem to be continuing to do a lot of, monitoring and surveillance there. But you didn't have that, elaborate kind of activity across the web that happened. And I think this is perhaps why they were caught flat-footed in August 2020, whereby, Zimbabwean Lives Matter just took off in a way that they didn't expect. And for a while, they just didn't have a response. They just didn't know how to do it. In the first couple of days, one person is trying to appropriate the hashtag, another one is ignoring it. Another one is trying to ignore, to distract and talk about, create a thread on Tanzania, but this thing is blowing up. Another person is trying to attack the South African celebrities who were promoting it. And they just didn't have that response. And so partly looking at that and knowing the history of this troll army, this is why I got a sense that it was under-resourced. But later in 2020, you then see them trying to really continue to become more and more active online. So I guess I would need to really get more evidence to firm up that thinking, that they're under-resourced, and see how they're doing it. But my impression for now seems to be that way. But I think I'll remain open to the possibility that, in fact, there might be something really important happening behind the scenes, and a lot of resources being thrown into this. It could be maybe periodically they throw more resources. And probably as we move towards the 2023 election, this machinery is going to be made more elaborate. So I think something that I will be watching for is what happens as we go towards 2023.
Does that answer your question, Miko?
Yeah, but just one quick follow-up, Tony, if I may. I mean, given this up and down in engagement, for example, what do you think incentivizes? So if, for example, there was a certain lull in the funding, what do you think incentivizes the continuation of this discourse, even without, for example, resources?
Mm-hmm. So some people suggest that they retain a skeletal framework, like they retain some people who are still in it. So there are a couple of accounts that have been constant. Now some of them have been pulled down after being reported to Twitter. So it does seem like there's a skeletal framework that remains, but at politically important moments, they try and ramp things up. But so I think one thing we'll see going forward is, so during the time of Robert Mugabe, the previous president, they didn't really take social media seriously. But I think in this new era, this is something that they take seriously and that they will always try and respond to. But I'm not sure that we will see. So I think it may be seasonal, that at particular moments where they want to, where they need to put in a lot of resources, before elections and before particular campaigns. So for example, around September, they had an anti-sanctions campaign, and they really devoted a lot of effort in trying to push that campaign. So I think there are a couple of moments where maybe they try and promote these ideas, or at least ramp up capacity, and there are times when they reduce capacity. But it's certainly something that I'll be looking into more closely.
Thank you, Miku. Tanya, I'm going to give you the last question before we start thinking about starting the second presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Tony. Thanks, George, for a great paper. Just to also echo Becky's comments about methodology, I really enjoyed seeing your pretty pictures of your network analysis. I think that's really cool, and I think a lot of us would love to learn from you in terms of what you've been doing. And I think your paper really makes a really strong contribution to the literature on social media and the public sphere in Africa. So my question is, if you could just reflect a little bit on who has access to Twitter, social media, the internet, Twitter in Zimbabwe. When you, in reflecting on your findings, I'm wondering, who is it that's having these conversations? Is it a digital elite? How does what's happening on Twitter fit into the broader kind of public sphere? Is it playing a kind of agenda setting role as we have seen in other places? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Tanya. That's a great question. I guess so. Zimbabwe in the region, for example, in Southern Africa, the data costs are amongst the highest in the region. And when you look at the country being in an economic recession for a long time, what you have is that the people who can actually access, this are limited. So we're looking at, in a sense, largely urban populace or group of people engaging around Twitter. And often it's quite educated, and with resources. So you have, in a sense, that kind of elite that is engaging here. What's interesting is the information ecosystem, the way that, for example, what happens on Twitter is then passed on to WhatsApp, where more people are. So WhatsApp is where you have lots and lots more people. And so you have this kind of filtering of conversations on Twitter onto WhatsApp, for example, using screen grabs. So normally in Zimbabwe, if you put a link, that's not the best way to do it. I'm on groups whereby if you put a link to a tweet, someone says, can you bring it down, and so people will then either they'll take the video from Twitter and download it and put it onto WhatsApp. And so you have this information ecosystem where things start moving across, from Twitter onto WhatsApp. The trouble is you can't really know what kinds of conversations are then happening on WhatsApp. And the tendency, I guess, is that WhatsApp, the groups are for people who almost have, who are like-minded, as it were. So there is a kind of filtering of conversations from the more, narrow kind of, elite group that's on Twitter onto WhatsApp. But I wouldn't be able to say how much of that filtering is happening, but I think a lot of the same debates are happening across these different platforms that are happening. But I guess there is that. So I guess there's a question of the digital divide and the digital elite that is on Twitter, but there is also the issue that conversations are actually happening and information from one platform is filtering onto another, and especially the more widely populated WhatsApp platform where more people are, and it's easier to be on WhatsApp because there are packages that allow people to get WhatsApp, for example, for a month for a minimum amount. But I think it's something, again, that I'd have to reflect on a bit more. But I think, yeah, definitely that's an interesting issue that I need to then come back and think about. So what?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe just to say, for those of us doing research in the continent and in this field, that I think the next big kind of methodological challenge is going to be exploring WhatsApp, because as you point out, there's so much happening on WhatsApp. And for other colleagues in an African context, we even have the expression same WhatsApp group, which refers to people's kind of political dispensation or political views, you know. So the WhatsApp group is becoming super powerful, but of course it's so difficult to research. Thanks, George. That was really, really interesting.
Great, thank you, George. Just a couple of comments before we pass over to Becky. I mean, I think it's a great paper. We've talked about it before, but I think the work that you're doing to build out the elements of the lie machine is really helpful to everybody else. So, you know, we all know there's lots of chatter on Twitter, and analytically, what's really useful about your research is you're starting to pull out, well, who are the agenda setters, the people who just set the scene for the rest of the day or the rest of the week, and where's the factory that generates the memes and the photographs, and where's the army that retweets and amplifies this in order that it gets into like a public consciousness, and where ordinary members of the public are retweeting it. How does that machine work? And we've looked at the work of Phil Howard, and I think he provides us some pointers. Other people on this call might look to that as a resource. But this paper is doing that for the first time in a structural way about this process in Africa. So we're grateful to you for doing that work. The second point I wanted to make is one that's been made in different ways already, and that disinformation online in Twitter is not the only tool. So as Tanya was just saying, you know, there are other social media tools, but as you started off by saying, you know, there's when it comes to repressive measures to close civic space in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean government has plenty of offline policy tools, arresting people, brutalizing them, torturing them, holding their families hostage, policing the streets to make offline protest impossible. And I think having that wider context of different tools is really important analytically when we try to answer the question that Miko and others were asking about, well, how much of a priority is this, and how much is being spent? Is this disinformation on the shoestring because there's only a shoestring? Or is it disinformation on the shoestring because that's the appropriate amount to be spending in August, but we're keeping under review how much to spend in September, you know, if the situation is different. And any government is only going to spend enough. It's not going to spend 100 times more than is enough. And so that calculation is going on in the minds of whoever's coordinating this inauthentic behavior. If 32 people is enough to create fear and uncertainty and doubt, to toxify the digital political sphere, then that's the right amount to be spending. But as you were saying, in the run up to the election, maybe the right number is 320 or 3,200, and that's not beyond the realms of possibility either. At that time, maybe they'll be deploying military propaganda units and buying in PR from South Africa or China or wherever. So there's very much more that we could we could talk about this. Thank you for stimulating the discussion, but time demands that we now give the floor to Becky to present her paper. So Becky, if you need to share the screen, please, you're ahead of me. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Tony. And thanks to George for that really incredible paper. That was absolutely fascinating. And I thought in particular, what's been described as the kind of use of malign creativity. So that work being done by the kind of undercover techies was really interesting as well. So the title of my paper is Online Misogyny, the Manosphere and the Silencing of Women's Voices. So I'm coming in at 3 angles. I'm hoping to make a theoretical contribution to the overall ICT for development narratives and how we think about gender and digital technology. But I'm also here, which is part of my role as leading digital and technology research at IDS, but I'm also here representing a program I work on called Countering Backlash, which is based at IDS. It's funded by CEDAM, which is working with partners around the world in Kenya, Uganda, Bangladesh, India and Brazil, looking at the backlash against women's rights globally. So I'm working on that program and I'm working alongside partners who want to do their own social media analysis, looking at the backlash and how it's manifesting online, which is why I was asking questions about methodologies, and I've been quizzing Tony and Kevin about methodologies. And also that leads to a kind of a sort of activist entry point of like, what do we do about online misogyny and the manosphere and the way that women are being attacked online. So there's kind of I'm coming in at 3 levels. So just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be just starting out with sort of thinking about how the kind of history of how gender and development have been conceptualized in relation to digital spaces, looking at how digital spaces have been used for feminist mobilization, then the reaction to that, which is online misogyny, gender-based violence, an exploration of why it happens, and then coming back to think about, well, what does this tell us about power? Where is the power, and why is it important to be thinking about power in gender, digital spaces and development? And then I'm just going to recap. So starting off with just a kind of backstory of the sort of dominant narratives of how in the ICT for development narratives, how digital technology has been thought about in relation to women's empowerment. So there's a screenshot there from an early book from the Hafkin and Taggart book from 2001, which was around the time that I started working on ICT for D, because I go back as long as Tony does in this space. And so there's this narrative of that technology is a catalyst for women's development. And so there's a quote which says that clearly these technologies offer substantial possibilities to improve the lives of women and their families. And that narrative didn't arrive in a vacuum. It was part of a kind of broader kind of sort of cyber vision of the 1990s that those of us around there, I'm sure, can remember that this sort of techno-optimism, really, the internet-based networking, as Julie Cohen puts it, would lead to the diffusion of power. So this idea that digital spaces would diffuse power. And we all know that it's actually led to a kind of concentration of power, but that was the kind of 1990s, early noughts kind of vision of the relationship between sort of technology and agency, really. But I would argue that these narratives, these kind of techno-optimistic narratives about the relationship between gender and women's empowerment kind of persist, and they've been co-opted by the private sector. So we've got a screenshot here from the GSMA and Women Programme from one of their videos. We see it in the SDG goals that there's SDG target 5.5b so ICT is promoting the empowerment of women. So these women's like, there's always this narrative that technology is going to empower women. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, although it's kind of obvious in a way, that just to keep in mind that is the dominant sort of development narrative, and also the dominant kind of commercial narrative if you think about the private sector companies that are involved in technology and development. arguably the big shift that we've seen since 2001, since the quote from that book I was talking about, that digital technologies are now a new kind of what Anita Gilmerty describes as a new structural paradigm that are shaping social relationships. But we haven't seen this reflected in the ICT4D scholarship, where there's only a kind of limited idea of what power is about, and it neglects what Insing Jen calls the shadow of disempowerment, and that's kind of what I'm going to be looking at. And there's a lack of attention to the way that ICTs kind of mediate the interactions between human agency and structure. It's all about the kind of positive empowerment and not enough about what the kind of negative aspects are of ICT in people's lives. Obviously, there's been a ton of scholarship going on in other domains, which we'll talk about later, which has been all about this shadow of disempowerment. But what I'm saying is that within the kind of our home domain of ICT for development, it's kind of been ignored, really. Meanwhile, so now I'm going to talk about digital civic spaces for feminist mobilisation, which kind of relates to the last talk in a way. So for the last kind of 15 years, we've seen social media as being a kind of a space for feminists, especially for women of colour who previously had limited access to larger audiences, what's described as a kind of global counter-publics. So people can kind of create their own spaces, maintain their own kind of bodies of knowledge. It's a way of arguably like democratizing the public sphere. So it's been really, really important. And this is kind of like the opening bit of the civic space in what we're talking about in this bigger panel, the opening up of civic spaces online. So just a couple of some examples. I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that there's a multiplicity of spaces. There's lots of different kinds of ways that feminists can come together, even if they don't agree about everything. It's a way of mobilizing around a particular hashtag. So Me Too is the kind of classic one that everybody knows about. So it was used 12 million times in the first 24 hours. And this is after the Weinstein revelations came out. In Brazil, the protests against Bolsonaro, there's the hashtag. So it was a way of uniting women with very different feminist politics. And I'm really excited to hear Corelli's talk tomorrow, talking about Mexico and talking about kind of feminist mobilization online in Mexico. And here's a study from East Africa. So a hashtag, Life Without Patriarchy, reached more than 190,000 people in 7 days. And it was a space for African women to engage others on feminism in their own words. And I think that's one of the particularly important bits of opening that online civic spaces offer, is that it's a way of connecting with politics and mobilizing in your own words, bringing your own life story to these spaces, and not feeling like you've got to talk in a particular way or use particular kind of language. It's a way for kind of to open up communication, especially to people who might not have been engaged with politics before. So it's an opening up of spaces to different kinds of communities and for different kinds of politics. Obviously, there's been a response to it. So in the next section, I'm going to be talking about online misogyny and gender-based violence, which is a closing down of these spaces and what it looks like. So the kind of categorizations of what online misogyny means, some of it was covered, so George was talking about in his previous talk. So some of it is trolling, just name calling, embarrassment. And the important thing to remember is how it, as we heard very powerfully in the last talk, how it translates into a kind of culture of violence and physical threats for women in real life. There's also an epidemic of non-consensual sharing of intimate imagery, which was being used in against women in public life a lot, and we're also seeing a lot more kind of gender disinformation. There was a really good report about malign creativity that was put out about the American elections recently. So disinformation which has a particular kind of gendered edge, accusing cisgendered women of being transsexuals, sort of slut shaming, all those kind of disinformation which is particularly targeted at women. And this is just part of the, I think one of the interesting things about online misogyny is that it's part of the kind of background noise of online civic spaces now. Like, we kind of take it as a given that women from across the political spectrum are going to experience this in whatever spaces. And when we do work on this with our students at IDS, I'm always astonished by the fact that it's not just happening on Twitter, that students will talk about online harassment as happening in, will happen on LinkedIn, it will happen on whatever platform women are on, they'll experience it. So it's not something that's just happening on Facebook or on Twitter. It's like whatever spaces, even spaces like LinkedIn, which are meant to be for kind of presentation of the professional self. So whatever spaces have opened up for women online, they're being closed down by online misogyny. So certain communities are more at risk. Research shows very strongly that women of colour, sexual minorities, and particularly women in politics, and there's been quite a lot of work about how women in politics are particularly at risk from online threats. And I think this is particularly a powerful quote that what's the intent is to deter women who might consider engaging in politics and to communicate to society that women should not participate in public life in any capacity. So it's not just about women, high-level politicians that we know have been a target of abuse. For example, Diane Abbott during the 2017 election was very much disproportionately, she was the Shadow Home Secretary at the time, she was disproportionately, as a black woman, the subject of abuse in the British elections. But it's not just about women at Diane Abbott's level, it's about all women, shutting down all women. So, for example, UN Women study on the 2017 Kenyan election showed how there was edited images, this kind of gendered disinformation in visual forms of women candidates being circulated online. Again, that kind of malign creativity. So it's sending a really strong message that women don't belong in online spaces. Another aspect of this is the global manosphere, which we heard about a lot because of the links to, there was quite a lot of work when Trump got elected, looking at the links between these kind of extreme forums on Reddit that then helped get Donald Trump elected. And they're kind of spaces where all these different kinds of groups, men's rights activists, pickup artists, men going their own way, incels. I mean, don't go Googling these people. There's some crazy people out there. They're sort of mobilizing this aggrieved masculinity, and we're seeing this globally. And in this manosphere, feminists, activists are kind of positioned as being enemies, the enemies of the people. And we've seen how people have also done studies, which links back to the bigger issue of closing civic space, where sometimes these harassment techniques are kind of tried out in the manosphere and then they're linked, that they're used by governments. And this is all about, again, closing civic space online. So why does it happen? It seems like a really kind of obvious but then unobvious question. And what I'm going to go and talk about now is how important it is to be looking at this issue from a whole load of different perspectives. Now, I think I had to include this because one of the obvious ways of thinking about why this happens is captured in this journal article, which is called "The Internet is Full of Jerks because the World is Full of Jerks, What Feminist Theory Teaches Us About the Internet." And in a way, it's easy to say, well, it's just because, like, oh God, I'm not going to use bad language, but just because there's loads of jerks out there and they haven't got anything better to do and they just want to go around harassing women online. But that's just way too obvious explanation. That I would see as part of kind of broader socio-cultural norms, that it's like it's okay to kind of talk about women in that way. You learn that when you're a teenager, you learn that when you're in your kind of boy gang at school, and then it becomes normal and you find yourself doing it online. So there's part, we can't consider online GBV as being something separate from the socio-cultural norms, from the way we treat each other in society, the way that we bring up our boys, basically. But I would argue and scholarship shows that there's a combination of enabling factors. There's a lack of sort of legal forms of address, despite the fact there's various kind of UN resolutions and companies have obligations under their sort of UN sort of treaties on human rights, and at national level, you have certain protections under law against violence, but they're not followed through, and you don't have the kind of policing capacities or commitment to see it through. And those social norms also feed into that women don't know who to complain to and what to do about it. And so those legal barriers kind of feed into the socio-cultural norms. We also have internet governance mechanisms dominated by corporations, very hard for civil society stakeholder groups to kind of influence these internet governance mechanisms, even though they have a kind of place at the table. They don't really have any kind of civil society groups, feminist groups, other civil digital rights groups don't really have teeth when it comes to internet governance. Big problem of unaccountable platforms and how they vary according to like actually, and also how good they are at responding to complaints, but it also depends on what country you're in. So in certain contexts, it might be quite easy to get a response from Twitter, and in other contexts, it might be quite difficult. So we've got platforms which are seen as being very unaccountable for the violence which they're kind of hosting. And we can't get away from looking at the design of these platforms. And it was really interesting when George was saying about the fact they're largely designed by straight white men and their algorithms promote extreme content. And it was really funny when George was saying, oh, well, I was following all these kind of pro-government accounts and this, and then the algorithm decides that you want to see more of this. And there's lots of scholarship saying, well, if you like one particular kind of quite mild kind of manosphere type content on Facebook, that's what you start seeing more and more of it. And it shows that it becomes more and more extreme. And so the algorithms are promoting this extreme content. So this tells me that you can't just, it's not just because the world is full of jerks, there's this combination of enabling factors, socio-cultural norms, we haven't even talked here about the kind of economics of it, and the algorithms promote extreme content because the money is in the clicks and in the page views, and how the more content you're exposed to and the more you're addicted you are to the platform, the more money the platform makes out of advertising. So that tells me that we need new ways, given that women are occupying these digital civic spaces, claiming their rights, getting their voices heard and then getting them shut down. That sort of says to me that we need to think new ways of thinking about where power is, and we need new ways for looking at the power, given that when we look at all these factors that are kind of causing or creating this enabling environment for online gender-based violence, for the manosphere, we need different ways to think about power and where it is. And I think we need to bring in theoretical tools from the broader realms of development studies and from gender studies and from people who look at power and participation. So the production of power is entangled with production of gender is entangled with the production of power. We can't understand the gendered power relations of digital spaces as being separate from the gendered power relations more broadly in society. What is power? It's the capacity of individuals or groups to determine who gets what, who does what, who decides what, and who sets the agenda. So we need ways of translating these ideas into digital spaces. So I've drawn on, this is actually a kind of classic way of looking at power that we use a lot. It's the Just Associates, Miller and Venneklassen, which we use a lot in our work at IDS, and lots of other people worked. I've used it when I worked for the NGO for Harmu, just as a really powerful way of getting into what power is and the different faces of power. And in this Miller Venneklassen model, there's three faces. There's the visible power, the making, enforcing rules, observable decision-making. There's hidden power, setting agendas, who's in the room, who's excluded, whose voices are sort of delegitimized. And then there's the invisible power, sort of shaping meaning, values, and what's normal. These aren't kind of hard and fast categories, but I think they're a really useful analytical tool, and they can do some useful work for us. So when I've been thinking about the sort of power mechanisms enabling online GBV, so the visible power that's enforcing the rules, it's the male-dominated IT industry that's designing the platforms, internet governance, IT ministries. When you do, there's been studies showing that I think like 83% of IT ministries are senior positions are occupied by men. There's also the visible power, which Tanya and Tony have been looking at in the African Digital Rights Network of internet shutdowns and network disruptions, which is the ultimate, like you shut down the civic space, the digital civic space completely. There's the hidden power, which is the anonymous men who are sort of perpetrating the online violence. There's disinformation against feminist activists, which there's been more kind of study of recently. And then there's this invisible power, which is the algorithms and the kind of platform architecture, which I was just talking about, which it kind of promotes and enables content. And then there's the way that there's kind of a new digital divide being created because women are just internalizing these threats of violence and harassment and being put off actually using the tools in the first place. Like it's actually kind of driving women off these visible platforms. Maybe it's driving them into kind of closed groups, into closed Facebook groups or closed WhatsApp groups because they just don't feel safe expressing views online. And I'm sure all of us can relate to the notion of maybe there's things which you wouldn't tweet about or you wouldn't kind of express online because you'd be concerned about experiencing some kind of harassment. And when we're doing that, we're internalizing these threats of like, okay, we're not going to take up that civic space, that digital civic space. So I think we need to bring in theory from different kind of disciplinary domains to look at. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I do think that sort of ICT for D, we need to be bringing together scholars from all these different domains to help us understand what's going on. So the kind of male-dominated IT industry, there's actually lots of really great work that's been done by people in what might be called mainstream ICT for D, just looking at gender barriers to kind of women's careers in IT and things like that. I think it's really important, as ADRN does, to work with digital rights activists to look at these kind of very visible expressions of closing civic space for women and online GBV. And with the hidden power, looking at the kind of studies that I was citing about the people who've actually gone in and done the kind of network analysis and the social media analysis of the manosphere and so on, they'll often be from social media studies and communication studies. And then finally, people looking at the kind of platform architecture, people from kind of surveillance studies and those sort of domains. But really what I'm arguing in this is that we need to bring different scholars together, and in our own work, we need to be sort of looking at how we kind of reference all these different domains, because you can't just understand it through this issue of online GBV through this one lens. So just a kind of quick recap to sort of give you, because that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's a dominant narrative of, we've seen historically in ICT for D, of digital tools as empowering women. There's a discipline, we haven't been thinking enough about the kind of shadow aspects of digitization, although there's been all this incredible work being done in different domains. This digital global counterpublic, as all these sessions are about, are really important for political mobilizing and citizens' voice, but digital civic spaces are closed to women by online GBV. As we know, as the blurb for this session says, this is really important for the achieving SDG Goal 16 targets about the institutions of global governance, participation of developing countries in these institutions of global governance. That should include internet governance. We won't get participatory representative decision making as it relies on equal access to digital civic spaces without women being able to participate, public access to information and fundamental freedoms. So the causes of and responses to online GBV cut across these different domains. You need to look beyond these political factors to look at the economic drivers, to look at the legal contexts, and you need a power analysis to understand and analyse these different domains and issues. So why do I think this is kind of useful? So my own work on a kind of theoretical level, it's quite useful for me to be thinking and I think for us all to be thinking about power in relation to gender and technology and development. It also suggests a kind of cross-disciplinary research agenda, which I think the African Digital Rights Network is doing. And then for activist researchers, such as those that I'm working with in the Countering Backlash programme, for them, they're not only conducting research, but they want to do this research to kind of have an impact on policy. And then looking at these kind of, this framework gives you an idea of like, okay, if I need to sort of, where's the hidden power in the digital economy that I need to be looking for. So just tons of references, but then I will share the completed PowerPoint later because I put in a lot of references. But thank you, and thanks to Tony and Tanya for earlier feedback on the presentation, and thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Becky. So let's open up the floor for questions and comments.
Thanks, Becky. That was again another really, really interesting presentation. And just in listening to you, I had similar question or similar thought to the questions I had with George's paper. And I'm wondering, where are poor women in all of this? You know, you do mention kind of marginalized groups with respect to race, but I'm wondering about class, you know, and I'm thinking, are they completely left out of this? You know, so they're already quite marginalized but by virtue of socioeconomic status. And you know, when you talk about access to digital media, who's driving these narratives? You know, there's often been the critique of the feminist movement that it's driven by middle-class white women. And I'm wondering, in your research, how do you think about these issues of sort of internal power dynamics, and which women control the narrative or drive the narrative? Where are poor women who may not have access to digital devices, let alone the internet? Where are they in all of this? So yeah, just kind of wondering about that. But again, really, really fascinating, if slightly depressing actually, research when you look at some of those kind of the symbolic and other forms of violence taking place online. But yeah, thank you.
So I think I've got two kind of responses to that. Firstly, in the Countering Backlash programme, one of the things that as a group of activists and researchers we've set out to look at is the way that it's kind of potential splits between kind of older feminists, I should probably count myself as an older feminist, and younger feminists coming in and using digital tools in kind of disruptive ways. So that's when all of the women are online. This is assuming that these are for groups where, just thinking about contexts where kind of established feminist groups haven't been able to kind of keep up with the kind of dynamism of kind of unruly protests happening online. And so I think there's a split there, which I think I'd be really eager to kind of work on with our partners, and just thinking about, well, established women's groups, and they probably haven't got the same kind of digital kind of agility and skills as younger feminists who come in more uncensored and more disruptive. So I think there's one angle of interest there. And again, absolutely this issue about who gets to speak online. And I think that's actually a call to do more research looking at this whole ecosystem that George was talking about, of like the way that, so instead of just looking at one platform, because I know when we've been talking about it, it's kind of really easy to look at Twitter because it's out there, and it's pretty easy to just kind of, not pretty easy, but you can just go in and analyze a hashtag. But actually looking at the broader information ecosystem, how does it be really interesting to do work looking at how information travels from Twitter through the WhatsApp groups, for example, and then out into the kind of broader domain. And I think any research that we do has to be informed by that kind of understanding of the broader information ecosystem, and then looking at the way that visible power is then shutting out certain groups of people. Like I don't know if it was I think WoodNet in Uganda did the work looking at who was, when they brought in the social media tax in Uganda, who was sort of shut out of conversations, because when you brought in the social media tax, it meant that certain people, certain groups of working class women just couldn't get online, and so they're excluded from conversation. So I think that's an argument for kind of research design, which looks, although it's difficult to do, doing those kind of digital ethnographies that looks at how information, both positive and negative, travels in different directions. And I'd welcome any ideas about how you actually work with people to do that. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. Really interesting.
Other questions and comments? I was just thinking about what Tanya said, and like, how would you operationalize this as an intersectional piece of work? And then trying to think through that to the so what questions of how would that be useful informing policy and practice moving forward? And in my head, it's a kind of a grid where if you look at what happens to white male politicians online, but who in some way threaten establishment power interests. So, you know, in a UK context, what happens to Arthur Scargill or Neil Kinnock or Jeremy Corbyn or any white male politician that threatens power, what tools and tactics and techniques are deployed against those people? And to what extent is that different from when those politicians are women or Black, like Diane Abbott or Priti Patel or AOC in the US? Because we have to try and work out to what extent these things are widespread and affect everybody in the same sense, or are kind of narrow cast and affect different sectors in different ways. So that seems to be kind of an operational research challenge to work out if and how these are different across intersectional dimensions. And then, and I can't work this next step out in my head yet, but so what do we learn from that analysis that enables us to act more efficaciously moving forward? And so are there particular tools and tactics and techniques that women or Black women or rural Black women can and cannot use in order to tackle the backlash and online issues? So that's one kind of big methodological issue that needs to be worked out. And then the other thing I wanted to say was kind of theoretical, I suppose. So you pose this question, why does it happen? Which I think is great to ask that direct, seemingly simple question. And part of the answer to why it works, as I think George's research was showing, is because it works, right? Why does power deploy violence and power? Because it helps to defend and protect existing power relationships. And so they're making an analysis of sorts about, do I need to do disinformation on a shoestring, or do I need to buy in PR companies, or do I need to deploy military assets? But the basic premise is that it works, and they know it works because there are decades and centuries of evidence that the deployment of different tools and techniques of violence and repression are necessary if what you're trying to do is defend unfair distributions of power. So I think that points, as you were saying, to like Batiwala's analysis and the the faces of power analysis, but I suspect that will only take you so far. Like I think it will help in terms of the interpretivist piece. It will help you describe the way things are. But we kind of know that, right? We kind of know everything is discriminatory and that power is unequally distributed. We will find that out in a more detailed way in this arena. But getting to the so what question, I think, might necessitate some more like bell hooks type theory. Like, what is it that underlies patriarchy and capitalism and imperialism? Is violence. It's the deployment of violence as a technique to defend the indefensible. So I suspect something like a bell hooks analysis will be more useful in answering the so what question than the faces of power will be. They'll be great at the interpretivist question, but not so much at the so what question. I'm done.
Oh, that was great. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Tony, I just had it's just a brief contribution, just that there are really interesting and important overlaps between our work, and your work really helps me to understand some of the things I see happening, especially that case with that member of parliament. So I guess one of the key things I wanted to say is, could I read your paper once it's done? Once you, because I'd love to, because it really helps me to think in more critical ways about what I'm seeing, and not just be in that kind of disinformation framework, but actually drill deeper and say, what is going on here? So I'll be, once you're ready to share it, I'd love to see it. Thank you.
And Becky, maybe methodologically doing the same thing in reverse, right? It's going to George, finding the case of that female Zimbabwean politician, finding other case studies of women who have been subjected to these kind of hailings and pile-on attacks. Because we know it's not coincidental that Diane Abbott received all of that hate mail, as much as all of the other politicians in the UK put together. It's not coincidental that the standout case in Zimbabwe is a female politician. And working out what tactics are deployed against them is part of the solution. But the so what question really is what needs to be done in order for women and underrepresented sections of women to take their place, to be able to safely speak in the public domain about issues of importance. What is necessary for that to be possible? That it seems that that's the ultimate question.
So it's interesting because there have been quite a lot of studies. There was done on quite a large scale by groups like Amnesty. There was a couple of great studies that have come out recently about attacks on women journalists, including the very famous the Filipino women journalist, Mika, I'm afraid I can't remember her name, have been done at a very large scale, but using like heavyweight computational techniques. And what's really great about the work that George has done is it's Maria Ressa, thank you. So there was a really great, I think it was a UNESCO study done at very large scale, looking at sort of plotting the disinformation that was used against her. But what's really great about the work that George has done is that it's kind of a bit more kind of homegrown and a bit more like one guy doing it, just you, George, sitting there doing it and figuring out what the right tools are to be using. And so I think the methodological challenges are like, especially working with the researchers that I'm working with in the Backlash program, they're not data scientists, they're sort of sociologists and public health people, and thinking about what are the kind of accessible tools kind of everyday researchers like us can use to get to those, to answer those questions without having to rely on being able to employ like a heavyweight data science company or have to go over to your local computing department or whatever. So those are some of the challenges.
And I think that's right. And partly what we've been trying to do so far in the African Digital Rights Network is understand and make use of the tools that are available. And George is definitely ahead of us in that process. So enabling people on the ground in each country to do their own monitoring, make their own analysis, and name the problem in their own language is the technical piece. But I think the naming piece that it leads to is really important. So having a conceptual language, or having a not an academic conceptual language, but having some naming convention for sock puppets and astroturfing that enable those on the ground researchers to name the problem is essential, because unless we can name it, we can't begin to resolve it. And I don't think we're there anywhere in the world yet, having a kind of a readily available nomenclature that's genuinely shared widely. So a lot more work to be done there. We had an expert called Erin Brockovich was going around in my head. Erin Gallagher is one of the experts in this kind of online social media analysis. She does lots of work in Latin America. And she's now working on a project to do some of this naming. And interestingly, in the digital citizenship work that we're now doing, one of the papers is about naming issues in Swahili. And what they're saying is the conversation, such as it is about digital rights, is only happening in 1 or 2 languages. And unless people can talk about these issues in their own language, then we're not going to get very far. So they're going through an official process of naming these digital right issues in Swahili, so that that dialogue and deliberation can continue in other languages too. Okay. Thank you, Tanya and George. Anybody else with a question or comment for Becky before we wrap up? Great. Well, thank you very much for the papers. It was incredible the way that they already directly speak to each other. And I hope we will carry on this discussion within the network. I hope that you would join us again tomorrow for our second session, which is at exactly the same time. Rini, who's in the audience today, is presenting. Corelli, who was here earlier, is presenting. So there will be more, there'll be a paper from Africa, there'll be a paper from the subcontinent, and there'll be a paper from Latin America, which I think will help us to broaden our horizons. So hope to see you again tomorrow at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those thought-provoking questions.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
See you tomorrow.